All right. Hopefully this will make me a little bit clearer. So hi, everyone. It's exciting to be here for the first grand rounds in some time. I have the distinct pleasure of welcoming Professor Hahn. I got to meet him pre-COVID. I think we have to decide pre-COVID, intra-COVID, and maybe we'll get to a post-COVID. But pre-COVID, when I was doing some work in elder abuse and was incredibly fascinated by his work. And I thought you all would be too if you're not already familiar. So Professor Hahn is a diplomate of the American Board of Professional Psychology and Clinical Neuropsychology. He's also the director of neuropsychology in the Department of Family Medicine, and he's a professor of family medicine, neurology, psychology, and gerontology. Take that at the Keck School of Medicine at USC in Southern California. He's interested in the study of factors that impact cognition and decision-making in older adults. He has special interest in using novel neuroimaging and statistical approaches to better understand these factors. He's incredibly well published, having close to or over 50 articles last time I counted. He has research collaborations with many other academic institutions. He was also a Beeson Scholar, something that I know many of us are familiar with here at UCSF, and he's currently chair of the NIA Clinical and Translational Research of Aging Review Committee. He is an inaugural governance committee member of the Global Council for Brain Health, which means that his effects are really not just locally and nationally, but internationally. I think he probably has many fascinating things to say. So if it's okay with you, I will end your introduction there and just say we're so thrilled to have you here. And thank you for putting up with us in COVID to actually come to see us in person.
Thank you. Thanks, Carla, and thank you, Louise, for hosting me, and thank you to everyone for showing up during this time that we're still in, very much so. And I appreciate you taking the time to come out to this talk. For what it's worth, I'm incredibly honored to be here. In my book and in a lot of people's books, UCSF has the best geriatrics department group in the country, actually, and I've heard that in NIA circles even. So it's not just me that says that, it's I think a widely shared sentiment. So when I was invited before COVID, and then things shut down and I couldn't come, I kept requesting if I could just wait until things opened up. And that waiting ended up being a lot longer than we all thought at the time, and we're still sort of in this time period. But again, thank you for being patient with me and for being such a great host. So I'm going to be sharing some of our work. I'm trying to understand financial decision-making in older age and the factors that have an impact on that and how that might relate to Alzheimer's disease. And so this is touching on a few different areas. So hopefully this is something that might be of interest to you. For what it's worth, I have a huge respect and am in myself in a section of geriatrics. And so again, thank you for all the work that you're doing on behalf of older adults. It's really, truly meaningful work, whether you're seeing people in clinic or doing research in this space. And I appreciate it along with my parents and all older adults. So with that, I'll start with my typical disclosure. And this was discussed. I'm a member of the Global Council of Brain Health. This is an independent science collaborative that's supported by AARP with help from Age UK. I also am a consultant to AARP Staying Sharp program. So they have a program to help older adults maintain their cognitive health as we grow older. And since we're in a different or sort of different time, I started doing this in my talks as well. So other disclosures, I'm vaccinated by 5 bivalent last Monday, and been testing almost daily for the last 5 weeks for lots of different reasons. I've been testing negative, and in case you were doubtful about that, here is my result from today, actually. So I feel fairly confident, but you never know, so I just wanted to disclose. As best as modern science can tell, I think I'm okay. So with that, I'm going to start off with the prologue. So a lot of the work actually that I've been doing in this space has started spiraling out. And what I mean by that is I'm starting to appreciate context more. So when we talk about financial decision-making, it's a big, big thing. There's lots of factors that go into that. There's emotional factors, there's cognitive factors, there could be contextual factors. And the context is increasingly important, and this is something that I've really been struggling with over the last few years in particular. And whenever someone makes a decision, there is a context there is a general context and that decision happens, and that decision could change depending on the context, actually. These are just some separate quotes here. All meaning is context dependent. That I actually heard in seminary circles. I was invited to go attend some seminary classes with some friends of mine, and I was really impressed to hear that there was an appreciation for context. Separate from text, or separate text from context, and all you have is a con. So that's I think a nice way of stressing the importance of this. Kenneth Nolan is an artist actually that works a lot with context actually, and this is an example of his artwork here. A lot of concentric circles, a lot of his artwork actually looks similar. And I think it actually helps to appreciate this idea that anytime you consider something, there's always a greater context to consider that, and also a context that's impacting. And then the final one is from MC Hammer, which I really love. And MC Hammer famously on Twitter got into an argument with someone who basically said all science is objective and all philosophy is subjective, and that's that. And his point here, which I think is a really important one, is that even in science, there's some subjectivity. There's an interpreter. There's someone interpreting that science, actually. And so that's something that I think is important to keep in mind, and it's something that's been influencing our work as of late. So I'm a board certified neuropsychologist. That's something that I've trained for, and what that means is I do a lot of cognitive assessment in clinical work. And so this is just some history. And I've always been interested, and this is part of the greater context of my talk, I've always been interested in the earliest signs of Alzheimer's disease, earliest cognitive signs, and now earliest functional signs. And we do believe that a decline in financial decision-making could be an early indicator of Alzheimer's disease down the road. And I'll explain a little bit more about that. But this is the greater context of which I'm actually coming to you all and talking about this topic. So I have a very clear Alzheimer's disease bent. And for better or worse, that's how I came into this topic area. I was seeing patients, and I had a string of patients, I remember this vividly, where I was seeing, and they were referred for early dementia neuropsychological workups because they were found to be giving away large sums of money. And there was a clear change in financial decision-making behavior, and there was presumed early dementia. So they thought, okay, we should have this patient go through the typical workup. I would do a clinical neuropsychological evaluation, and often would do hours of testing, 6 to 8 hours of testing. And time again, patient after patient, they tested normal. So there was clearly frustration on the part of the family and the caregivers who referred the patient. The patient loved it because basically it was just sort of a stamp of approval on all of this decision-making changes that we were seeing. And clearly we were missing something here. And so it's actually from clinic that this topic area and research got its birth, actually. And so I just wanted to, again, value the importance of clinical activity, having a hand in clinic. It's something that honestly, I wouldn't have really done this without that experience early on. So in terms of actual background for this, you may or may not know this, but older adults over the age of 65 hold about a third of the nation's wealth. And so this is based on David Laibson's work. He's an economist at Harvard. And this is based on estimates in 2011. And so we know in 2011, or compared to now, there are a lot more older adults, actually. So it's likely that older adults over the age of 65 hold more than a third of the nation's wealth at this point. However, a portion of older adults, and not all older adults, but a portion of older adults experience scam and fraud and financial exploitation, experience a severe loss of financial capital, savings that has been painstakingly saved over a lifetime. And these cases can be very, very tragic. I say it's a portion of older adults because it's not all older adults that experience this. That would be an ageist viewpoint in this. Not all older adults will experience poor financial decision-making, scam, or fraud. But there are a portion of older adults that do experience this. And the reasons for this are pretty wide open. It's not well understood. And this topic is so important that the FBI maintains a website just on this topic, scam and fraud of older adults. And this is what it looks like. It's changed over the years, but this could be a resource that could be helpful to you all in trying to understand what are some of the current scam and fraud situations. Now, we know this could make sense because as we grow older, we will tend to lose some of our brain. So this is summed over all older adults. These are the areas that tend to decline. This is part of normal aging, actually. So we will lose some of our frontal lobes in this situation. And this is, again, summed data over a large group of older adults. However, every time I present a picture like this, I always want to also highlight the fact that there's a lot of inter-individual variability in this picture. There's individual variability, and not all people will experience a decline in brain regions or areas of the brain. Not all areas of the brain will decline readily with age, and so that's an important caveat. So these are individual plots over time, and you can see some older adults actually experience an increase. So what's with that? That's a whole other conversation that I have, and a whole other lecture I have on brain health. But there are ways as we grow older to actually increase brain. But generally speaking, as we lose brain, so do we lose general cognitive ability. And so again, this is summed over a large group of older adults. And this is a summation over all brain regions and cognitive abilities. But again, not all cognitive abilities will decline with age. And so this is seminal work from Denise Park. And we know that certain cognitive abilities decline with age more readily than others. Some of those cognitive abilities are processing speed, working memory, our ability to keep track of multiple things at once. Some of the actual increases are in areas like semantic knowledge, so the ability to acquire knowledge. So with age comes wisdom. There's some truth to that general notion, at least until much older age. So again, there's variabilities, individual variability here. So it's more complex than what we might think. Right around the same time that we started thinking through these issues, we actually saw this. I was a part of the Russell's Alzheimer's Disease Center in Chicago at the time. And the New York Times actually came out with this article, just sort of independently. This is an anecdotal article that seemed to highlight and point to the fact that changes in financial handling might be one of the earliest signs of Alzheimer's disease. And this was just, again, it's not a study. This was based on anecdotal interviews of people who had family members who had developed dementia, and that this was actually one of the earliest observed signs. So this got us all thinking, could this be an early functional marker of Alzheimer's disease down the road? So it made sense to us at the time that if someone's experiencing cognitive impairment, that that an older adult might make poor financial decisions. So this was sort of the low-hanging fruit, if you will, at the time from an empirical standpoint. So we looked at this. We looked at older adults who had mild cognitive impairment, MCI, on a measure of decision-making, and this measure had financial decision-making and health decision-making aspects. And we saw that older adults in regression models adjusted for age, education, and sex had performed more poorly on this decision-making measure. And then we looked at the specific cognitive domains that were involved in this, and you can see those here. So it does make sense that as an older adult is experiencing cognitive decline, that particular older adult might be at risk for making poor financial decisions. We also have a measure of susceptibility to scams, and I'll talk more specifically about what this measure looks at. But in this measure, we also looked and saw whether or not people with MCI actually performed more poorly on this measure. And we saw that. We actually saw that people with MCI compared to older adults without MCI actually were more susceptible to scams based on this measure. And again, we looked at cognitive domains here involved. I'll just point out things like global cognition, episodic memory, and perceptual speed were some of the cognitive domains specifically that seem to be associated with this. And then in the same vein, we wanted to look at financial and health literacy. And in our own work, and this is a whole other talk here that I won't get into today, but people who have more acquired knowledge in financial matters and health matters do better on decision-making measures. That makes sense. If you have more acquired knowledge, more experience, it makes sense that you might make better decisions. And so here, we found that people with MCI actually had lower financial and health literacy, again, compared to older adults who did not have MCI. And we saw this interesting interaction effect where, oh, wrong mouse, right here, where older adults who had higher education, that higher education tended to buffer the effect that MCI had in the loss of financial and health literacy. And so education is important. It's something that helps. Lots of work has identified education as a way to maintain cognitive health in older age. Here we saw it important for maintaining financial and health literacy. What I just showed you were a set of studies, and we have others also, which really points to the idea that if an older adult is experiencing cognitive decline or cognitive impairment, they might be at risk for making poorer financial decisions. Generally speaking, that makes sense. And anytime I give this talk to a medical crowd, the first thing that people say is that, well, if someone's making poor financial decisions, it's because of cognitive impairment. But I also shared with you that I saw patient after patient where they were cognitively intact, but seemed to show cognitive impairment. So what's with that? So that's something that actually I wanted to empirically look at. I was still part of the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center at the time, and they do these large longitudinal studies, cohort studies of aging and Alzheimer's disease. And I wanted to see, based on my clinical work, how many in a normal, non-demented older adult sample had a discrepancy, a difference between their decision-making ability and their cognitive ability. I already described to you that in my clinic, I started seeing examples of this. So I thought there must be some portion, may not be a large portion, but there might be some portion that might show a difference between their decision-making ability and their cognitive ability. And so what we did was we took their decision-making ability and created a standard statistical score for that, and took their cognitive ability and took their standard and made that a standard score. And generally speaking, if you thought that decision-making ability was just cognitive ability, that their decision-making ability should be within a range of their cognitive ability. So if someone has poor decision-making ability, they should have poor cognitive ability. If someone has high decision-making ability, they should have high cognitive ability, right? So if it's really just about cognitive ability, we shouldn't see any discrepancy. It should be just within that range of their cognitive ability, their decision-making ability and cognitive ability. And to make a long story short, this is what we saw. So we saw a lot of blue, and all the blue here in this group of 600 plus older adults, non-demented, showed decision-making ability within their cognitive ability. However, we see a lot of red here and a lot of green. We hypothesized we would see the green based on my clinical experience. The green is where you have someone performing lower on their decision-making ability relative to their cognitive ability. What was surprising is that we saw a lot of people in red also. So people actually showed better decision-making ability relative to their cognitive ability. And so about, if you total the green and the red here, it's about 25% of this normal sample. Normal, I say normal as in non-demented sample. About 25% showed a discrepancy between their decision-making ability and their cognitive ability. And so this was something that actually I was really happy to see, because I was seeing these patients in clinic. What I wasn't prepared to see was the red, actually. This actually points to the idea that some people might be able to make financial decisions, even though their cognition might be slipping. And that's an important consideration, particularly if you're considering something like financial capacity assessment. It really calls for a full, robust evaluation of an older adult's ability, and not just considering their cognitive ability. It's important, but there's lots of other factors. So basically, if an older adult becomes a victim of scam or fraud, it has the potential to have a huge devastating impact on the life of that older adult, on their independence, well-being. It has impacts on their caregivers. It has impacts on the greater community. A lot of work that has come out since I left Rush, headed by Patricia Boyle, has really related this to greater incidence of Alzheimer's disease down the road. So we do seem to have some data now. But understanding this is still a question. So how can we understand why all this is happening? And that's something that I've tried to understand from a neuroimaging standpoint. So that's one perspective that I'm going to be sharing some of our work in. We know that from the seminal work at NIA, that brain changes could happen years before any noticeable cognitive changes. So it could be that we could look at the brains using neuroimaging and see if there's any sort of subtle signs of change that could help explain why someone might be making poor financial decisions ahead of any noticeable cognitive impairment. So neuroimaging is one method that we could potentially help us understand this approach. So giving this talk in a bunch of different circles, some people think that this is what I'm describing as a neuroeconomic approach. And neuroeconomics is the integration of economics and neuroscience methods. This is a picture of the textbook, really great textbook. And I just want to say that there are a lot of better neuroeconomists than me. So these are all the better people that you should follow and follow up on. They're doing really great cutting edge work in this. A lot of these people are actually down the street from me at Caltech, actually. But my friend Greg Semenis-Larkin at Duke has done a lot of seminal work in this. And people are starting to actually turn towards aging to try to use these methods. So, so before I go on, I just need to acknowledge a lot of great work in this area. But this became the rationale for my Beeson Career Development Award. So I wanted to use this neuroimaging approach, this neuroeconomic approach, to try to understand why certain older adults are making what seemingly poorer financial decisions. There's a lot of really great people involved in this. I wrote this when I was at Rush. David Bennett was my primary mentor, so I need to acknowledge him and his support. Randy Buckner really provided a lot of essential early input in our conceptual models. And then Mark Lax and Laura Mosqueda have also been really key to this work as well. So I just need to acknowledge that. We relied on a lot of really great resources at Rush. And so these are just some of the examples of the resources that are there. David Bennett started the Memory and Aging Project. It's a large longitudinal study of aging where they follow people annually until participants die, and then they get their brains and actually are able to do neuropathology. Dr. Patricia Boyle started a decision-making study, and this is something that helped collect a lot of the early decision-making data. And so what I did was propose for my Beeson is to collect neuroimaging on top of the already collected data that was being collected at the time. And just to give you an appreciation for how multidisciplinary this work is, this box here represents how you calculate financial risk aversion for a single individual. I have literally no clue what this means. To this day, I still don't understand what all the terms mean. But what I do know is that if someone gives me a number that this gives, I can relate that to neuroimaging, which I do know. And that's basically how this has worked. I need to acknowledge all the hard work ahead of me that happened before I came in and did all this neuroimaging stuff. So with that, it was also impressed upon me that I needed to have some idea of what was happening in the brain. This was Randy Buckner's input early on, who's a neuroscientist at Harvard. And we know that amyloid and neuropathological markers of Alzheimer's disease seem to impact specific brain regions more so than others, at least early on in the pathogenesis. These same brain regions have been related to the default mode network, and the default mode network is famously tied to Alzheimer's disease. This is, if you go to neuroimaging conferences, this is like shown every other talk, if not every talk, actually. So we know that neuropathological markers seem to impact default mode network. Default mode network seems to map onto the earliest changes in Alzheimer's disease. However, there was always something that bugged me about this picture. And it's actually this. So you have neuropathological accumulation in the medial frontal lobes, but that doesn't tend to readily decline in the context of Alzheimer's disease. And so I argue, and a lot of us argue, that this actually does have a functional impact, and that functional impact could actually manifest in financial decision-making. A lot of these same brain regions are involved in valuation, in decision-making, self-referential behavior, and these are connected to other default mode network brain regions. So I am arguing that this actually does have an impact, and this is why some older adults might show poor financial decision-making ahead of any noticeable cognitive impairment. If you actually look at neuroeconomic work, a lot of the neuroeconomic work was focused on younger adults. This is an example of a review paper that highlights the brain regions that seem to be important for making optimal financial decisions, again, based on the work that was done mostly in younger adults. And what's interesting is that a lot of these same brain regions are actually implicated and affected by age-related neuropathology. And so, not a lot of people has put two and two together, actually. And so, so basically, this is something that I think we've been trying to follow up on. We've been trying to follow up and develop more specificity for. This is our one of our more recently published models here, which is available in a book that just came out this year. So we think that neuropathology impacts default mode network, and whether you have anterior or posterior impact, that could actually manifest in differential presentation of financial decision-making and episodic memory. You could have potentially an individual that shows financial decision-making declines ahead of episodic memory decline if you have more of this anterior network implication. You could have an individual that has memory decline first and then financial decision-making decline. You have more posterior presentation of this. You could have it present at the same time. You can have an individual that actually doesn't ever develop Alzheimer's disease down the road that ends up dying before the development of that due to cognitive resources, cognitive reserve. And then you have just some aspect of that here. We do think that the insular cortex is important in this as well. The insular cortex is the hub of the salience network. And that salience network, I think, is also involved in poor financial decision-making. There's a whole other slide that I didn't include because it goes into the specific brain regions that are connected to all these regions. But for the sake of time, I'm happy to talk to you about, we have very specific thoughts on the brain regions involved. There's lots of brain regions like the anterior basal ganglia and the anterior cingulate, orbital frontal cortex that are connected to the anterior part of the default mode network. And that's something that we all think is involved in this picture. But again, for the expediency's sake, this is a general conceptual model. So we have a lot of neuroimaging papers to date. Actually, I just realized this doesn't include all of them, but I'm just going to highlight some general findings. One is risk aversion. This was the first study that we actually looked at, and we wanted to base. This was the first published study from Advisen. I wanted to just see, can we see a difference between older adults who are high in risk aversion and low risk aversion? And are those differences in keeping with previously published work? And so, to make a long story short, we looked at this in 27 older adults who were high in risk aversion, 27 low. These were in older adults, and we adjusted for age, education, sex, and global cognitive ability, was able to see very subtle differences here. Again, these are very low numbers. So, but at least it was a proof of concept that seemed to be showing that we were on the right track. Temporal discounting is one of the measures that we have been using, and temporal discounting refers to the tendency to discount a larger reward offered at a later time for a smaller reward offered more sooner. So a classic example is, say I offer you $5 now or $500 an hour from now. Most people will wait the hour for that $500, right? But some people might be disinhibited and actually take the $5 now. And so generally speaking, being able to wait is generally associated with better outcomes. And so we wanted to see this. You can parametrically vary the amount that's offered. You could parametrically vary the time that you have to wait. And you can create some really interesting crossover points to see where an individual might land. But generally speaking, getting that, waiting that larger time frame for that larger amount is the better choice, generally speaking. So here we are looking at 123 non-demented older adults, adjusting again for age, education, sex, and global cognitive ability. So we're adjusting for global cognitive ability. And here we found that the ventromedial prefrontal cortex is very involved in taking that more immediate reward. And that's consistent with previous literature. What's interesting here is that for these older adults who are non-demented, integrity of the right parahippocampal gyrus is associated with taking that better choice, that later reward. And so we argued in this paper, which was the first in an older adult sample at the time to ever look at this, from what I understand, that integrity of those memory networks, that posterior part of the default mode network, is integral for making better choices in this particular situation. So it really does point to the integrity of that default mode network being important. And it does point again to this idea that we might be able to see in brain using neuroimaging, these associations with poor financial decision-making ahead of any noticeable cognitive impairment. We have followed this up with a DTI measure. DTI is used to measure structural connectivity of the brain. And to make a very long and complicated story short, what we saw was that the more connected the brains were, the better they made that temporal discounting choice. So the more connected the brains were structurally, the better the choice here. Again, pointing to the idea that the better the brains were, the more healthy the brains were, the more better the choices were. And this was again adjusting for age, education, sex, and global cognitive ability. Financial literacy, I mentioned the importance of this before. Here, we looked at 139 non-demented older adults and really found that the anterior and posterior default network nodes in the middle of the brain were very connected to, or very associated with financial literacy. This was again adjusting for age, education, sex, and global cognitive ability. We followed that up again with a DTI study looking at a group of older adults, and it found, generally speaking, the same thing. The greater the connectivity in the brain, the stronger the financial literacy in the brain. This is actually in the right hemisphere where you're seeing most of the association. This is radiologic view, so right is left. So we're seeing most of these in the right hemisphere, these associations in the right hemisphere. Susceptibility to scams is a measure that was developed by Patricia Boyle. And what she did is actually looked at work done by AARP and the FINRA organization. And actually, what they did was they interviewed older adults who have been the victims of scam or fraud. On this measure, we used a voxel-based morphometry approach. And what that tells us is the gray matter density in the brain. If there's any associations on a voxel level with gray matter density between the measure. And this is the measure here. The first item is I answer the phone whenever it rings, even if I do not know who is calling. So you can imagine if an older adult does that, they're going to be more susceptible to scam or fraud. So generally speaking, with voxel-based morphometry, I'll just share as a neuroimaging person, you never really see much actually in terms of associations. I was shocked when I saw this. And so what we saw was a very circumscribed, in the right hippocampus, association between gray matter density in the right hippocampus and susceptibility to scams. This is adjusting for age, education, sex, and global cognitive ability. So this is over and above global cognitive ability. And so basically, it's very circumscribed in the hippocampus, actually. And this is the kind of thing where I can't make it up. It just sort of happened. Actually, it sort of came out this way. I will say, there's a lot of spread. So we're using large numbers of participants here. And so I just wanted to point out that there is a lot of spread here. So it's not like we can run out and actually individually image someone and say if they're going to be more susceptible to scam or fraud. A lot of people in the Department of Justice want that right now, actually, but I'm the first to say we can't do that. What we're seeing is grouped data or average over a group. And just like I said at the beginning, there are individual variations in that need to be appreciated. But generally speaking, in this group of over 300 non-demented older adults, less gray matter density in the right hippocampus is associated with greater susceptibility to scams. These are people who are non-demented. So we're seeing some brain imaging associations that seem to indicate a change in potential financial decision-making behavior ahead of any noticeable cognitive impairment or decline. Following up with the DTI study, just like before, this was spearheaded by Melissa Lamar, who's with the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center and is great, really does a lot of great work. And to make a long story short, we saw the same thing. So essentially, the more connected the brain is, the less susceptible to scams that individual is. And again, we saw mostly in the right hemisphere, these associations. So with that, I just want to point out across different modalities, different neuroimaging modalities, we seem to be seeing more right hemisphere associations. We're trying to figure out if we should make a big deal about this. I go back and forth. People have very different opinions about this, but some people really think that the right hemisphere might be more sensitive to pathological aging indices, like Roberto Cabeza at Duke. Other people really don't and think that hemisphericity is not a great consideration. I personally think there might be something here, but I leave it open to you to consider. So this is the point in the talk where I usually tell people to take a step back. So a lot of people are really compelled by the brain imaging findings. It's like this picture. It's like very clear, like spot right here. And people want to say, hey, can we actually brain image someone and actually see if they're going to be susceptible to scam or fraud? And that I need to acknowledge a lot of this work was done at Rush. It's one cohort, one group of older adults, and need to be replicated in different parts of the country by different people using different methods. So we don't know if we can really make a big deal about this as of yet. So I will also say that as I was doing this work during my Beeson years, I was actually pouring through the neuroeconomic literature. And I was actually really not impressed with how little, how do I say this? how not representative the samples were in a lot of the neuroeconomic literature. They were a lot of them were using convenient samples that were college students. Even the college students weren't that diverse. And so I really started wondering, if we need to start looking at more diverse samples actually to really make sense of whether or not what we're seeing is actually something that could be extrapolated across people of different backgrounds. We also know that contextual factors, so things like access to literacy, socioeconomic status, may explain a significant portion of any racial differences observed due to historically documented institutionalized racism and unequal access to supportive resources. There's a huge history of this. It's striking actually just how different families are in what they share about financial decision making. I never had a class on this, so it's not standard education. So the cultural factors I think are really important, and in particular the contextual factors are really important, and also history. So right around the same time I started thinking about this, NIA was actually developing its own health disparities framework. This was spearheaded by Carl Hill. And so, so actually this is something that, I'll share this. So, right around the same time, someone pointed out I was in this article on Westworld. And Westworld is this HBO show, and what they quoted me in, which I wasn't interviewed for this, they actually pulled this from somewhere, but they did pull this from a great article that I was interviewed by in the Atlantic by Ed Young. And in this article, I made the point that, honestly, a lot of the neuroimaging research in specifically AD and dementia was just really not representative samples. And so we can't extrapolate out. And until we do actually diversify the study groups, we can't really make broad claims on the neuroimaging work that was being done. And so, so basically, this all sort of started circling at the same time in my head, and got hooked up, or really went out of my way to seek out Lisa Barnes's input on all this. Lisa Barnes has been studying older Black adults in the Chicagoland area and cognitive decline, has a couple studies focused on this. And so we developed a racial differences in decision-making among older adults, trying to understand what are the contextual factors that explain any potential racial differences observed here, and really focusing on the contextual factors. So one result here that I'll just share is we wanted to look at decision-making. If you look at decision-making alone, just based on the measure alone, without considering any other factors, there is a difference. However, if you consider acquired financial literacy, acquired health literacy, so the ability to actually develop specialized knowledge in these topics, if you consider that, the racial differences go away. So it really does point to this idea that contextual factors are important. Equal access to resources are important. If you actually make those resources equitable, it actually helps level the playing field. It helps explain the racial differences observed. In doing this work, we realize a lot of really early steps in this work haven't been done. So, there's been a bunch of neuroimaging studies, focused on cognitive decline in older, primarily white adults, and not much in older Black adults, even though older Black adults are at more of a risk for cognitive decline in Alzheimer's disease. And so we took a step back and started just focusing on older Black adults. And so here we saw brain imaging associations with perceived discrimination and the insula. The insula is a brain region that gives you a gut reaction about a social situation. And so we saw that functional connectivity of this brain region varied with how often or how much discrimination was reported among older Black adults, which seemed to make sense. One thing that has always been a bone, or at least an issue of mine, is that if you actually talk about these topics of financial abuse in certain circles, it's generally known that older Black adults experience more scam and fraud than older white adults. It's a generally known fact. And some in these circles have made the erroneous assumption that older Black adults might be more susceptible to scam or fraud just because older Black adults experience more scam or fraud. And I never bought that. I always had an issue with that, because just because a people group experiences more scam or fraud doesn't necessarily mean they're more susceptible. They could be targeted more. There's a whole host of reasons that could be, and contextual reasons that could be pointed to about this. So I said, okay, let's do the study. We had a measure of susceptibility of scams. These are the general results here. And if anything, older Black adults are actually less susceptible to scams than older white adults. And these are these specific items that actually show the difference. Older Black adults, if anything, are less susceptible to scams than older white adults. So why is there a difference? It's because of greater targeting. At least that's our contention in this paper. Shoot, I didn't include it. So we started looking at things like cognitive decline in older Black adults. That's a recent paper, and I must have taken the slide out for time. But so we're actually taking a step back and focusing on older Black adults with some of these issues, because a lot of the early work just hasn't really. And so we're trying to actually level the playing field when it comes to these considerations. So this is the point in the talk where I say, hopefully by now you can appreciate there's like lots of reasons why certain older adults might make decisions, poor decisions, better decisions. And we really need to consider as many factors as possible. So one of the first people I had a conversation about this topic with is Mark Lax, and Mark Lax is the head of geriatrics at Cornell. And first time I ever met him, we actually bonded on the fact that we were seeing patients that were seemingly cognitively intact, but were giving away large sums of money. And we ended up having a conversation that was about an hour and a half long. First time I ever met him, hour and a half long conversation. And he said, hey, we should write this up. And I said, okay, let's write it up. And so, he then went on sabbatical and then actually sent me a draft. And I said, based on our conversation, and he was like, oh, I'm going to send it to Annals of Internal Medicine. I was thinking, okay, fine. I don't know much about it. Come to realize it's actually one of it has a huge impact factor. It's actually one of the most respected papers. I didn't know this at the time. So, but basically we just outlined all of the potential reasons. This is not a study. We just, based on our clinical experience, we literally just published an opinion paper based on some of the factors that we saw. And these are some of the factors that we outline in cognitive, emotional, medical, functional, psychosocial, environmental, societal. The truth of the matter is that older adults are just targeted more because they have more wealth. So an older adult might become the victim of scam or fraud, not because they're vulnerable, it's because they're just targeted more. And so that needs to be considered. When this paper came out, I literally thought no one would read it. And as soon as it came out, Reuters picked it up, and my cell phone like blew up nonstop for like a week, and people were calling me at all different times of the day and night wanting to talk about this, because I think we struck a nerve actually. So this is something that, the point is to appreciate that there's really a lot of factors that could explain why certain older adults might make decisions in certain ways. So now I'm at USC, and at USC, I'm trying to understand all these different factors actually. And so we're using a lot of different tools to try to understand all the various factors that might go into why certain older adults might make poor financial decisions. And this is just some work that we published from my ongoing studies to date. Here we found that older adults who are cognitively intact that have experienced financial exploitation report higher depression and anxiety symptoms, also poorer sleep. I had a postdoc fellow who was interested in frailty, and we did see that older adults who've been the victims of scammer fraud had higher frailty. Former postdoc who's now faculty in Israel actually continued the brain imaging work, and this is on a group of older adults in Los Angeles. So separate, much younger, non-cognitively impaired in Los Angeles. And the good news is that we saw similar brain regions implicated. So in particular, medial temporal lobe, medial frontal lobe, and the insula, these regions seem to be really associated or differently in older adults who have been the victims of scammer fraud. And the other nice thing, or not nice thing, but we were able to sort of verify, or at least this is based on self-report. So we're in the process of verifying through qualitative data collection, the reports of this, the financial scammer fraud. Speaking of qualitative data, one of the things that I've come to appreciate, even though I've been a quantitative person all my life, is the value of qualitative data collection. This is Dr. Annie Wen, who's 2 doors down from me in the hallway in family medicine, and she's a qualitative researcher that I basically just roped into doing this work. And she's been interviewing all of our older adults who've been the victims of scammer fraud. And so she put together a first paper based on the qualitative data she's been collecting and we're interviewing older adults to really try to understand all the different factors that we're missing, seem to be missing when considering this. This paper came out, it was selected as editor's choice, and she was invited to give a talk at GSA this year. This is not her area, but it literally had such an impact that she's now sort of like blown away by it. So a lot of people want their story told when it comes to this, and I think this sort of gave a voice to some older adults, so it's been nice to see. We're following up using text-based surveying methods, and interpersonal relationships was an area that we always wanted to follow up on, and the pandemic actually allowed us to do this. So what we did was we developed a text-based survey method where we would send a short survey every 2 weeks for 6 months during the pandemic. And then we related changes in relationship quality to financial exploitation vulnerability. There's a measure that's actually out there now. And so, and we found that as people's relationship quality dipped, so did their financial exploitation vulnerability increased. We actually saw this in a lockstep fashion over 2 weeks, over 6 months. And so this was led by my current postdoc, Dr. Aaron Lim. And so we're actually trying to follow this up with an R1 to try to look at this more broadly. And I'm hoping we can actually apply this to a national cohort. Most recently, we published, and we have a grant looking at this. I was shocked by this. We have a lot of economics measures that we're incorporating. One of them is this question. It's basically just a single question. We just gave you $10. There's some random person online. How much of that $10 do you want to give that random person? And you can just vary from 0 to 10. I was like, there's no way anyone's going to give away $10. Like, I would just keep the $10. Like, why would anyone just give it to some random person online? And lo and behold, the amount that these are non-demented older adults, the amount that people were willing to give away was associated with worse performance on neuropsych measures that are particularly sensitive to Alzheimer's disease. So it's not like they were performing in the impaired range. It's literally in a stepwise fashion. The more people gave away, the worse they performed on these measures that are specifically sensitive to Alzheimer's disease and not other measures. So they're the ones that are specifically sensitive to Alzheimer's disease. I was blown away by this, actually. I genuinely thought nothing. I was like, who would give away free $10? But the truth of the matter is that there are some older adults. We tried to see if income explained this. Like, it makes sense if someone makes a ton of money, they would just give away the $10. Maybe income didn't explain it. We adjusted for other demographic factors. It's truly that the more people gave away, the less they performed well on these measures that are specifically sensitive to Alzheimer's disease. So we're actually following up on this pretty heavily now. Laura Mosqueda is the person that recruited me to USC. She does a lot of elder abuse work, as Carla alluded to before. And I think she saw the relevance of the work we were doing. I wasn't even thinking about elder abuse, as crazy as that sounds, when I was recruited to USC. But since being there, And being across the hallway from the National Center on Elder Abuse, I started appreciating elder abuse more, all the work that goes into it. And financial abuse is clearly a form of elder abuse. But one of the great things that I've benefited from is just learning from her and learning from the center. And one of the models that they've used is actually this AIM model. And I think it's a really important concept. So I've been talking a lot about the older adult vulnerabilities, right? A lot, whatever that means. However, in this AIM model, there's three major components to consider. There's a potentially vulnerable older adult. There's the trusted other, or the person perpetrating at that moment, and then the context in which that happens. You can have an older adult that's not vulnerable at all, but you can have a very aggressive perpetrator, actually, and that could result in financial abuse. You could have a contextual situation that actually results in greater incidence of financial abuse. So even though I've been focusing mostly on the vulnerabilities of the older adult, it could be that older adults experience this without any vulnerabilities because of these two other considerations. And so we're thinking through this more, what that means. So this is my summary. I'm not going to read every point here because I try to hit it along the way. But I think aging, I'll just really acknowledge this last point, that aging experts are uniquely equipped to evaluate the complexities of financial decision-making in older age. I think you all here are uniquely equipped to think through this. Because of geriatrics specifically, my mind has been broadened. And so thank you for the work that you're doing. It's helped me appreciate the context, all the factors that go into this. And then, just a few quick words on what we're doing now. We have an RF1 now where we're really, we're longitudinally following people and seeing if their financial decisions change, their behavioral economic decisions change, their cognition changes, and their brain imaging changes. So this is a 3-year longitudinal study of non-demented, non-cognitively impaired older adults, half of which have been the victims of scam fraud. We also have been really following up on this idea that this could be a potential functional biomarker for Alzheimer's disease. And so my grad student, Laura Fenton, who's pictured here, wrote a nice summary article that covers some of the things that we're going to try to follow up on. And then, in some final words, a lot of what I've been doing recently is just policy considerations. So I was when Carl Hill was at NIH, and I told him, someone needs to think about disparities, racial disparities in this space. The first time I met him, he said, "Oh, okay, great, come to NIH and tell people." And so I literally was like flabbergasted. The first time I ever met him, like within 30 minutes, he's like, "Okay, we need you to come to NIH and tell people what this actually." And so I ended up going there, and this is my first time at NIH actually talking about not even data I had at the moment, just that there needed to be consideration of this. At that meeting, I met I believe the CF or the COO of, I'm sorry, it's Deb Whitman. She's actually high up at ARP. She's the one that actually invited me to be a part of this global council on brain health. I've been invited on Capitol Hill to present this to the Social Security Advisory Board, which advises Congress on Social Security. The Department of Justice has been really interested in this. Gave a talk at Harvard Law School, actually, because lawyers are interested in this topic. I've been working a lot with the FTC, the FBI, and other organizations to really try to develop policy considerations of all this. And I think it's been really eye-opening, honestly, and really humbling to be in these circles to try to think about what are the implications of all this work. And so I think it's just an encouragement for us all to consider that greater context. So that's all I have. I have a bunch of acknowledgements. I'm sorry, I think I might have ran over a little bit on time, but these are all the people that I needed to acknowledge in the funding. So thanks for sticking with me up until this point. Thanks.
Fantastic talk. Thank you so much. It was such a great area of research. And so we always give a plaque to our visiting professors as a thank you. And so it says teacher affects eternity. And so anyway, so that's a thank you. And then because this is the 25th anniversary of the division, we also got him a 25th anniversary t-shirt.
I will wear it with pride. So thank you. This is great.
And maybe since I'm up here, I'll take the prayer of just asking the first question. Because I'm just thinking of all the patients I see in my clinic who I would benefit of, like, how do I talk about this? Or, not even waiting to figure out who's at highest risk or not, just like, how do you sort of make this part of a conversation so the people don't get scammed, or, at least you try and mitigate some of that?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think in my clinic, I started bringing this up actually as part of my assessment, interview, and evaluation. Actually, is first to assess how things are going, but really just to ask and to highlight that scam and fraud is, unfortunately, we didn't talk about this. We have some studies showing that some trusted others, unfortunately, might be involved in that scam or fraud. And so I see it as sort of a education is important. The more that you can put things into the minds of older adults to be wary of, I think that that's just helpful. And so, from a financial planning perspective, I think that's also important. So helping older adults think, I know it's not pleasant now, but if someday you might not be able to handle your finances, what might you do about it? Just even to put that in the conversation at some point, not that it demands an answer, but just to raise it. Some people might think it might seem a bit insensitive to bring up in the clinic context. Most of the time I've ever done it, it's been appreciated. And so, so just greater encouragement to have that, I think, be a part of the potential, clinical check-in evaluation. So, one other unrelated question is that we see a lot of older adults who've been the victims of scam or fraud, and they don't, and they are shamed by it, and understandably so. An interesting byproduct of this work is that, and this comes from Laura Mosqueda, actually. She said that when she sees some people that are really distraught by being the victim of scam or fraud, she says it's helped to be able to say, hey, your brain might be making some changes, and it may not be you volitionally being sucked into a scam or fraud. And she says that's helped in some cases, actually, to say, this could be just lapses in judgment, that could be aging brain associated situation. So so I offer that as well in case that might be helpful. So yep.
Have you kind of looked at sort of teasing out the different types of sort of scam or fraud, like in terms of whether or not if somebody were to say, your bank account is at risk and we need this information as linked to the bank versus something where, if somebody gave information that they might be gaining some type of financial benefit.
Yeah, great questions. So the question is, have we looked at different types of financial scam or fraud and seeing if those are associated with different factors? And the short answer is yes, very much so. There, depending on the scam or fraud, certain, trust might be more of an issue in certain scams or fraud, and then just general attention and working memory might be in others. And so that's why we're doing the qualitative follow-up. Our hope is to actually to have enough data that we can break down these different scam or fraud situations, so that then we can see what the factors are associated with this type and this type. I have colleagues at the University of Florida that are actively sending spam emails to research participants to try to scam them, to see. And so that's actually, I wish I thought of it, honestly. It's kind of a brilliant way to kind of, and they're agreeing ahead of time that they might be sent emails to scam or fraud, and then they're taking people who actually respond and creating groups based on that. So there's lots of interesting work in this space now, much more so now than 10 years ago. So, yeah.
I'll take one final question from here in the chat. Dr. Phillips asked, what might you suggest that geriatric healthcare providers do to assess an individual's risk of scam?
So that's a great question. I think I can share, I'm a part of a working group that's trying to develop methods to do this more standardized, actually. So right now, I think interviewing and asking, gentle but direct questions about it, I think is a practical way to assess how things are going. And hopefully we'll have something more tangible soon from this working group.
All right, well, thank you.